The Mafia boss slammed her husband's hand onto the table and slid her a ring. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The chill in the restaurant had nothing to do with the air conditioning and everything to do with the man sitting across from Alara Vance. Her husband, Julian, was a monument to cheap arrogance, all polished surfaces and a hollow core. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist, his garish gold watch catching the candlelight as he spoke to the woman beside him, Isabel, his mistress of the last 6 months. They were supposed to be celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary, a fact Julian had either forgotten or chosen to weaponize. He had insisted on this restaurant, a place known for its discretion and powerful clientele, the perfect stage for his particular brand of cruelty. Alara felt the gazes of other diners like physical blows, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She had become a ghost at her own table, an inconvenient reminder of the vows Julian had so casually discarded. Her presence was the punchline to a joke she was forced to endure, her silence the price of a loveless marriage that kept her family's legacy, a once-proud architectural firm, from crumbling into complete insolvency. And then, Julian was saying, his voice loud enough to carry, I told the board if you want vision, you invest in me. You don't stick with old, tired ideas. He glanced at Alara, a smirk playing on his lips. It was a barb aimed directly at her father, whose old, tired ideas had built the company Julian now commanded. Isabel giggled, a vapid, tinkling sound that grated on Alara's nerves. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on Julian's arm, her red nails like drops of blood against his expensive suit. Alara focused on the condensation beating on her water glass, tracing a single droplet's path as it slid down the crystal. It was a small, meaningless act of control in a life that had spun completely out of it. She had once been a woman of substance, a partner in her father's firm with dreams of designing structures that would touch the sky. Now she was just an accessory, her spirit worn down to a fragile, translucent thing. Julian had seen to that, systematically dismantling her confidence with 1,000 tiny cuts of casual disdain and public humiliation. From across the room, a man watched. Dante Morty did not look like a man who noticed such domestic tragedies. He sat alone at a corner table, a glass of dark amber liquid untouched before him, his presence a vortex of stillness in the bustling restaurant. He was the CEO of Morty Global Holdings, a construction and logistics behemoth that had devoured its competition and reshaped the city's skyline. But the whispers that followed him were not of boardrooms and stock prices. They were of the old world, of shadows and bloodlines, of a family that had ruled the city's underbelly for generations. He was a king in a bespoke suit, his power so absolute it needed no announcement. He saw the woman, Alara. He saw the way she held herself, a study in quiet dignity under assault. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes before she smoothed it away, the subtle tension in her jaw. He saw the hollow man beside her, a peacock puffing its chest, and the leech clinging to his arm. Dante Morty had no tolerance for weakness, but he had even less for men who paraded their dishonor like a prize. He had heard of Julian Vance's hostile takeover of Vance Architecture, a firm with a long and respectable history. He had also heard that Julian had acquired the founder's daughter in the deal. Seeing it now, the crude reality of it sparked a cold, precise anger in his chest. Julian, emboldened by the wine and Isabel's fawning attention, went too far. He reached across the table, not for Alara's hand, but for the simple gold band on her finger, the one her grandmother had worn. You know, darling, he said, his voice slick with contempt, this old thing is rather depressing. It screams of tradition, stagnation. He tugged at it. Perhaps it's time for an upgrade, or better yet, a complete replacement. Alara flinched, pulling her hand back. That was the moment. The final, unforgivable trespass. The air grew thick and heavy. A shadow fell over their table. Dante Morty stood beside them, his 6'3" frame eclipsing the candlelight. He had moved with such silence, such predatory grace that no one had seen him approach. Julian looked up, his face a mask of confusion and annoyance. "Can I help you?" he snapped, dismissing the stranger with a wave. Dante's gaze was not on Julian. It was on Alara. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, held a question, a silent offer. In that brief, charged moment, Alara felt a flicker of something she had long forgotten, defiance. She met his gaze and gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission he needed. With a movement too fast to follow, Dante's hand shot out. He seized Julian's wrist, the one with the ostentatious watch, and slammed it down onto the center of the table. The sound was a sickening crack of bone and a crash of shattering porcelain and silverware. Julian screamed, a high, pathetic sound that was instantly swallowed by the collective gasp of the restaurant. Isabel shrieked and scrambled back, her chair toppling over. Dante paid them no mind. He held Julian's hand pinned to the splintered wood, his face a mask of cold fury. "A man who dishonors his wife in public," Dante's voice was low, a gravelly rumble that cut through the silence, "is not a man, he is a liability." He leaned in, his words for Julian alone. "And liabilities are removed." He released his grip, and Julian cradled his mangled hand, whimpering, his face pale with shock and terror. Dante then reached into his jacket pocket, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He produced a small, velvet box. He didn't open it. He simply slid it across the table, through the wreckage of their anniversary dinner until it stopped directly in front of Alara. His dark eyes locked onto hers, intense and commanding. "Marry me instead," he said. It was not a question. It was a declaration. A claim. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of impossible silence. Lara stared at the box, then at the powerful, dangerous man who had just shattered her husband's hand and in the same breath offered her a new life. It was insane. It was terrifying. It was a lifeline. In that moment of pure, desperate instinct, a lie that felt more true than anything in the past 3 years formed on her lips. "Yes," she whispered, the word a fragile thread in the heavy air. Dante's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, perhaps satisfaction, passed through his eyes. He extended a hand to her. "Let's go." And without a backward glance at the whimpering man or the wreckage of her former life, Alara Vance placed her hand in his and allowed herself to be led away. The ride to Dante Morty's penthouse was a blur of city lights streaking past the tinted windows of a car so silent it felt like a moving tomb. Alara sat stiffly on the supple leather, the velvet box cold and heavy in her hand, a tangible piece of the surreal dream she had stepped into. She hadn't spoken a word since leaving the restaurant, her mind a maelstrom of shock, fear, and a bewildering sense of liberation. Dante sat beside her, a looming presence of quiet authority. He did not press her for conversation, content to let the silence stretch, giving her the space to process the cataclysmic shift that had just occurred. When they arrived, a private elevator opened directly into a sprawling apartment that seemed to float among the clouds. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic, glittering vista of the city she had once dreamed of shaping. The space was a testament to masculine elegance and immense wealth, all clean lines, dark wood, polished concrete, and art that was clearly worth more than her family's entire company. It was beautiful, breathtaking, and utterly intimidating. It was a cage, but a gilded one. Dante walked to the vast window, his back to her as he looked out over his domain. "My lawyers will contact you in the morning," he said, his voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the violence he had so recently displayed. "They will have divorce papers drawn up. Julian will sign them. He will not contest. He will cede all assets from the Vance merger back to your family's control, with you as the sole beneficiary." Alara finally found her voice, though it was small and unsteady. "How can you be so sure?" He turned to face her, and the full force of his predatory stillness hit her. "Because I will tell him to," he stated simply, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. And in his world she realized it was. "This isn't real," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You can't just claim a person." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a dangerous, unsettling sight. I just did, you agreed." The word hung in the air between them, agreed. Her lie of desperation was now being forged into a bond of terrifying permanence. "I was in shock," she stammered, trying to claw back some semblance of control. "I'm grateful for what you did for me, truly, but this is insane. We don't know each other." He crossed the room in a few fluid strides, stopping just before her, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He was impossibly close, and she could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the faint, clean scent of expensive cologne and something else, something uniquely him, ozone and power. "I know enough," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre that sent a shiver down her spine. "I know you are the daughter of Arthur Vance, a man I respected." I know you were sold to a worthless coward to save a legacy. I know you have spent 3 years suffocating in silence. And I know that when I offered you a way out, you took it." He reached out, not to touch her, but to take the velvet box from her trembling hand. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a diamond of breathtaking size and clarity, its facets catching the city lights and splintering them into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It was a queen's ransom, a shackle. "This is not a proposal of love, Alara," he said, his voice soft but laced with steel. "Not yet. It is a contract, a statement. You will be my wife, you will wear my name. In return, you will have my protection. No one will ever disrespect you again. Your family's name will be restored. Your future will be secure. All I ask in return is your loyalty." In the days that followed, Alara was drawn deeper into his world. He was a man of absolute control, orchestrating her life with quiet, ruthless efficiency. A new wardrobe appeared in the massive walk-in closet of the suite he had given her, filled with designer clothes in her exact size, chosen with an impeccable taste that was both flattering and unsettling. He arranged for the quiet, professional movers to transport the contents of her old art studio, the one Julian had relegated to a dusty storage unit, into a light-filled spare room in the penthouse. He didn't ask her permission. He simply anticipated her needs and fulfilled them. It was a form of dominance more potent than any command, a golden chain of consideration and care. She resisted at first, asserting her independence in small, futile ways. She insisted on making her own coffee. She refused the personal driver he assigned her, choosing to walk through the city until she realized she was being followed at a discreet distance by 2 of his men, broad-shouldered shadows in dark suits. Her protests were met with a calm, unyielding insistence. "You are with me now," he would say, the words a simple statement of fact. "Your safety is my concern." Yet, for all his control, there was a strange temptation in the life he offered. She found herself watching him, fascinated by the paradoxes he presented. He was a brute who could shatter a man's hand without a flicker of emotion, but he would listen with rapt attention when she spoke about the principles of cantilevered design, his questions sharp and insightful. He commanded a shadowy empire with whispered phone calls in Italian, yet he took the time to have her favorite obscure brand of tea stocked in the kitchen. The temptation wasn't just the wealth or the security, it was him. It was the intoxicating feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. One evening, she found him in his library, a room paneled in dark mahogany and lined with books on history, philosophy, and engineering. He was studying a set of blueprints, his brow furrowed in concentration. She stood in the doorway, and when he looked up, the usual mask of command was gone, replaced by a flicker of something quieter, almost weary. "These plans for the new waterfront development," he said, gesturing to the table. "They lack soul. They are functional, but they say nothing." He looked at her, his gaze direct and challenging. "What would you do?" Hesitantly, she walked over, her old instincts stirring to life. She studied the plans, her trained eye immediately seeing the flaws, the missed opportunities. For an hour, they talked, not as captor and captive, but as equals, 2 minds engaging with a problem. The tension between them shifted, becoming less about power and more about a startling, dangerous current of attraction. He stood close, his arm brushing hers as he pointed to a detail on the page, and the brief contact was like an electric shock. She looked up and found him watching her, his expression unreadable but intense, and she knew she was falling. She was being drawn into his orbit. And the most terrifying part was that she was no longer sure she wanted to escape. The divorce papers arrived via a stone-faced lawyer whose briefcase probably cost more than Alara's first car. They were simple, direct, and utterly devastating for Julian. He was to sign away everything, every share, every asset, every last vestige of his connection to Vance architecture, and disappear from her life. In return, Dante Morty would allow him to keep his health. Alara expected a fight, a final, desperate burst of narcissistic rage from Julian. Instead, there was silence. Days turned into a week, and the signed papers were returned without comment. The silence was more unnerving than any threat. Julian was a man whose entire identity was built on public perception and dominance. Such a complete and humiliating defeat was not something he would accept quietly. She soon learned why. A story broke in a notorious gossip column, a salacious piece detailing the tragic end of her marriage, painting her as a conniving gold digger who had callously abandoned her loving husband for the city's most notorious billionaire. It was filled with fabricated quotes from anonymous friends who spoke of her coldness, her ambition, her instability. Julian's fingerprints were all over it, his cowardly revenge enacted not with fists, but with poison ink. The article was a brutal, public stripping of her dignity, dredging up the very powerlessness she thought she had escaped. The old shame washed over her, cold and suffocating. She retreated into herself, the walls of the penthouse that had started to feel like a sanctuary now closing in like a prison. She avoided Dante, embarrassed and humiliated, feeling as though she had brought this ugliness, this tabloid filth, into his pristine, powerful world. He found her in the art studio he had built for her, staring out the window, the offending article open on a tablet beside her. He said nothing at first, simply coming to stand beside her, his solid presence a silent anchor in her storm of emotion. "He will regret this," Dante said finally, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "No," Alara said, her voice shaking. "Don't, it's what he wants, a reaction. Another fight will only create another story. Please just let it go." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders, a stark contrast to the fury simmering in his eyes. "Alara, no one attacks what is mine and gets away with it. Ever. This is not just about you anymore. An insult to you is an insult to me, to my name. It is a sign of weakness I will not tolerate." The next day, Julian Vance's world imploded. A series of anonymous tips to federal investigators led to a full-scale audit of his business dealings, uncovering a web of fraud and embezzlement he had used to prop up his failing ventures. Simultaneously, a far more private and brutal message was delivered. Alara never learned the details, but Dante's right-hand man, a grim, silent man named Luca, returned late that night with a faint scrape on his knuckles and the matter-of-fact report that Mr. Vance had decided to take an extended, indefinite vacation abroad and would not be heard from again. The gossip column printed a full retraction, citing gross factual inaccuracies, and its editor was summarily fired. The swift, absolute, and terrifyingly efficient nature of Dante's response left Alara breathless. He had not just solved her problem, he had erased it from existence. She was horrified by the casual brutality of it all, yet a shameful, undeniable part of her felt a profound sense of relief, of safety so complete it was intoxicating. That evening, the atmosphere in the penthouse was thick with unspoken things. Dante seemed distant, preoccupied, the violence he had unleashed on her behalf lingering around him like a dark aura. She found him in the library again, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring into the depths of the unlit fireplace. She felt a strange compulsion to understand the man behind the mask of ruthless power, to see the source of the fierce, protective loyalty he had shown her. "Why?" she asked softly, standing in the doorway. "Why go to such lengths for me, for my honor?" He was silent for a long moment, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of its usual command. "My mother," he began, his gaze fixed on the empty hearth, "was a good woman, gentle. She loved my father, but she was not from his world. She never understood the rules, the dangers. When I was a boy, one of my father's rivals decided to send a message. They didn't come for my father. They didn't come for me. They cornered her at a charity luncheon, a place she felt safe, and they humiliated her. They insulted her, called her names, implied things. They did it publicly to show my father that he couldn't protect his own wife, that his most precious possession was vulnerable." He took a slow drink, the muscle in his jaw tight. "My father hunted them down. What he did to them, it was the stuff of nightmares. But it was too late. The damage was done. My mother was never the same. The light in her just went out. She became a ghost in our own home, afraid of whispers, of glances from strangers. She faded away. He won the war, but he lost his wife." He finally turned to look at Alara, and in his eyes, she saw not a mafia boss or a CEO, but the boy who had watched his mother break. The wound was ancient, but it had never healed. "I will not allow that to happen again," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of pain and regret. "I will not allow another man's weakness to destroy the woman at my side. I will burn the world to the ground before I let that happen." In that moment, all her fear of him dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. She crossed the room and, without a word, reached up and gently touched his face. He flinched at the unexpected contact, then leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a brief second. The mask was gone. In its place was a vulnerability so raw and deep it stole her breath. This was the real Dante Morty, a man forged in pain, driven by a fierce, desperate need to protect. And she realized, with a startling jolt of clarity, that she was no longer just his possession or his responsibility. She was falling in love with him. The revelation of Dante's past became a bridge between them, spanning the chasm of their strange beginnings. The arrangement, once a contract of protection, began to feel like a true partnership. The tentative attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface ignited, transforming the grand, empty spaces of the penthouse into a home. Their nights were no longer spent in separate wings of the apartment. They were filled with long conversations that bled into the early hours of the morning, with a slow, deliberate exploration of each other that was both intensely physical and deeply emotional. He showed her a side of himself no one else saw. The quiet man who loved old films from before World War II, the strategist who could dismantle a rival's empire on paper, and the surprisingly gentle lover who mapped the scars of her past with a tenderness that unmade her. In turn, Alara began to flourish. With the shadow of Julian gone and her family's firm secure under her control, her creative spirit reawakened. She started designing again, her mind alive with ideas. Dante encouraged her, converting a whole floor of the Morty Global Holdings building into a state-of-the-art studio for her, a gesture that was both a lavish gift and a public declaration of her importance in his life. Their connection deepened into a quiet, powerful romance, an intimacy forged in the unique crucible of their circumstances. But with this deepening love came a chilling awareness of its price. The world Dante inhabited was not one of boardrooms and black-tie galas alone. It was a realm of shadows, where loyalty was currency and betrayal was paid for in blood. She saw it in the constant, vigilant presence of Luca and his men, in the way conversations would halt and shift to clipped Italian whenever she entered a room, in the lethal stillness that would sometimes settle over Dante when he took a call on his private, encrypted phone. The danger was an invisible third party in their relationship, a constant, menacing presence. The cost of his protection was her freedom, the cost of his love, her safety. Her life was no longer her own. It was inextricably bound to his, and by extension, to the violent legacy of the Morty family. This reality came into sharp focus with the emergence of a new threat, Marco Vescovi. Vescovi was the head of a rival family, a man known for his ambition and his brutality. He saw Dante's efforts to legitimize the Morty empire as a sign of weakness, and he saw Alara as the key vulnerability, the crack in Dante's armor. The first incident was subtle, a warning shot. A prized architectural model for a children's hospital she was designing, a project she had poured her heart into, was vandalized in her new studio. Security footage was mysteriously erased. There was no proof, but Dante knew. His face became a granite mask of cold fury. He doubled her security, and the penthouse became a fortress. Alara felt the golden bars of her cage pressing in, the constant surveillance a suffocating reminder of the world she now inhabited. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, began to creep back into her life. She saw the worry in Dante's eyes, a shadow that he tried to hide from her, but that was always there, lurking beneath the surface of his calm control. He knew Vescovi was testing him, prodding at his greatest weakness. One night, as they stood on the balcony, the city lights a silent, glittering carpet below, the tension became unbearable. "This is my life, Alara," Dante said, his voice heavy. "This ugliness, I never wanted it to touch you." She turned to him, her heart aching at the conflict she saw in his face. "You can't protect me from your whole world, Dante." "I can try," he said fiercely, pulling her into his arms, his hold both possessive and desperate. "I am changing things. It's slow, it's complicated. I am moving our operations, focusing on the legitimate businesses, cutting ties with the old ways. It's what my father never had the courage to do. I'm doing it for us, for a future where you can be safe." It was a promise, a monumental one, offered in the quiet of the night. He was offering to reshape his entire world, to dismantle a century-old dynasty of violence for her. The magnitude of his declaration was staggering, but it was underscored by a terrifying reality. His enemies, men like Vescovi, would not let him simply walk away. They would see his transformation not as progress, but as an abdication, an opportunity to seize power. The promise he made was also a death sentence. The price of their future was a war. The final move from Vescovi was not long in coming. It was not an attack on them directly, but something far more cruel. A young foreman from one of Dante's construction sites, a man with a wife and a new baby, a man whose family had been loyal to the Mortys for generations, disappeared. A day later, a single chilling photograph was sent to Dante's private number. The foreman, bound and gagged, with a newspaper from that day held up beside his terrified face. The message was clear. Vescovi was no longer sending warnings. He was demonstrating that he could reach anyone, anywhere. He was coming for Dante's family, his loyalty, his soul. The danger was no longer at their door, it had kicked it in. The kidnapping of the foreman, a man named Paolo, plunged Dante's world into a cold, controlled state of war. The penthouse became a command center, filled with the quiet, tense energy of men preparing for a final confrontation. Dante was a figure of pure, lethal focus, moving through the rooms like a caged panther, his every action precise and deliberate. He was caught in an impossible bind. A full-scale, old-world retaliation would be swift and bloody, but it would inevitably lead to more violence, pulling him deeper into the life he was trying to leave behind and confirming to his enemies that he was still the same ruthless man his father had been. A more surgical approach, however, one that prioritized Paolo's safe return, would be seen as weak, a hesitation that a man like Marco Vescovi would exploit without a second thought. Vescovi was counting on this dilemma, using an innocent man's life to force Dante's hand. Ilara watched, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer the paralyzing fear of a victim. It was the fear of a partner, of a woman watching the man she loved walk into a fire. She refused to be a liability, a fragile thing to be hidden away. She found Dante in his office, staring at a map of the city, his face etched with the strain of the impossible choice before him. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice steady. He looked up, his eyes dark with a weariness that went bone deep. "I am going to get my man back, and then I am going to end this." "The old way," she pressed, already knowing the answer. He gave a sharp, grim nod. "It's the only language Vescovi understands." It was in that moment that Ilara made her choice. She would not be the reason he abandoned his promise. She would not be the gentle woman who broke under the strain of his world. She walked to the map and pointed to an industrial area near the docks, a district she knew intimately from her architectural surveys. "Vescovi is using an old, abandoned cannery here," she said, her voice firm with a certainty that made Dante's head snap up. "It was owned by a shell corporation that went bankrupt 5 years ago. I remember it from the zoning reports. It's isolated, structurally unsound in places, with a complex network of old service tunnels underneath. It's a perfect place to hold someone." Dante stared at her, a mixture of shock and dawning respect in his eyes. "How do you know this?" "Because I know the city," she said. "Not your city of shadows, but the city of concrete and steel, the bones of it. He thinks he's smart using a forgotten place, but nothing is ever truly forgotten." Her knowledge changed everything. It gave Dante an advantage Vescovi could never have anticipated. It was not the brute force of his organization, but the sharp intelligence of his partner. He devised a new plan, one that was not about overwhelming force, but about precision and strategy. It was a high-risk operation that relied on surprise and a deep understanding of the terrain, Ilara's terrain. As his men prepared to move, he turned to her, his expression a mixture of fierce pride and raw fear for her safety. "Stay here, lock the doors. Luca will be outside." "No," she said, her resolve hardening into steel. "I am not your mother, Dante. I will not be a ghost in this home, waiting to see if my life is going to fall apart. I am with you in this, all of it." She was not asking for permission. It was a statement of fact, an acceptance of the price of their love. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, and in his eyes, she saw his final surrender. He was not just fighting for her, he was fighting with her. He gave a short, sharp nod. He understood. His fight to protect her had transformed her into someone who could stand beside him in the storm. The reckoning was swift and silent. Using Ilara's detailed knowledge of the cannery's layout, Dante's team infiltrated the building through the service tunnels, bypassing Vescovi's guards completely. They moved like shadows, a testament to their deadly efficiency. Paolo was rescued without a single shot being fired. Vescovi was cornered, not in a blaze of glory, but in a damp, crumbling office, his overconfidence his undoing. Dante faced him alone, the final confrontation a quiet, chilling affair. There was no grand battle, only a final, whispered verdict. Marco Vescovi disappeared. The official story would be that he fled the country, his empire collapsing in his absence. The truth was far simpler and more permanent. Dante had ended the threat not with a war, but with a surgical strike, proving that his new way was not one of weakness, but of a more refined and lethal form of power. He had chosen the path that protected his future with Alara, reshaping his methods to fit the man he was becoming for her. They stood on the penthouse balcony days later, the city quiet and peaceful below them. The storm had passed. The danger, Alara knew, would always be a part of their lives, a shadow lingering at the edges, but it no longer terrified her. She had faced it and chosen to stand her ground. She was not the fragile woman from the restaurant anymore. She was a queen who had helped her king win his kingdom. Dante came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was no longer just her protector, he was her partner. He had proven he was willing to change his world for her, and she had proven she was strong enough to live in it. "I am giving you full control of the new Vance Morty design division," he murmured into her hair. "Build whatever you want, reshape the skyline, make it ours." It was more than a gift. It was a testament to his trust, a merging of their worlds, their futures. She leaned back against him, her hand covering his over her stomach. The ring he had slid across the table, once a symbol of a desperate lie, now felt like a promise that had been truly earned. Their beginning was born of violence and impulse, but their future, the one they would build together, would be one of conscious, unwavering choice, a love forged in fire and just as strong. 2 years had passed, each one a lifetime away from the shattered porcelain and splintered wood of a restaurant table that had served as the stage for a brutal rebirth. Alara Morty, a name she now wore as comfortably as her own skin, stood before a vast, floor-to-ceiling window in the headquarters of the Vance Morty Design Division. The office was hers, a minimalist expanse of glass, steel, and concrete that she had designed herself, a space that spoke of clarity and strength. Below her, the city sprawled out, a complex and beautiful organism of ambition and history. She was no longer just an observer of its skyline. She was a creator, a principal architect of its future. Her latest project, the ridiculously ambitious Avalon Tower that would be the tallest residential building in the state, was rising from the ground, a testament to her vision and Dante's unshakable will to give her anything she dreamed of. She traced its nascent form against the clouds, a quiet smile touching her lips. The woman who had once traced the path of a single drop of condensation on a water glass, searching for a modicum of control, now commanded the construction of giants. Her focus was absolute, her presence in the studio, a source of both inspiration and respectful trepidation for her team. She moved with an economy of motion and a quiet authority that mirrored Dante, an unintended consequence of their profound connection. The timid, broken wife of Julian Vance was a ghost, a memory of a different woman from a different life. Alara had not just been saved by Dante. She had been forged anew in the fire of his world, and she had emerged harder, sharper, and more resilient than she had ever imagined possible. She had learned the unique language of his life, the nuances of power that flowed beneath the surface of polite society. She understood that the safety and peace they now enjoyed were not accidental. They were maintained by a constant, vigilant pressure, a quiet promise of overwhelming force that kept the wolves at bay. This knowledge did not frighten her. It grounded her. It was the price of their life, a price she had willingly and consciously chosen to pay. Her reverie was broken by the soft chime of the private elevator that opened directly into her office suite. Only one person used it. Dante stepped out, looking as though he had been carved from the same dark, powerful materials as the city itself. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that did little to conceal the formidable strength of his frame, but his eyes, those stormy depths that could command armies and quell rebellions, were soft as they landed on her. The mask of the CEO, the Don, the king of the city's complex underworld, fell away the moment he saw her, leaving only the man, her husband. He crossed the vast space, his gaze sweeping over the models and schematics for the Avalon Tower, a flicker of immense pride in his expression. He did not speak until he was standing behind her, his warmth enveloping her, his hands coming to rest on her waist as he joined her in looking out at their city. "It will be magnificent," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It already is." She leaned back against the solid wall of his chest, her body relaxing into his familiar strength. "The engineers are complaining about the Western cantilever. They say it's pushing the boundaries of the material's tensile strength. And what do you say?" he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "I say they need to find a better material," she replied without hesitation, a hint of steel in her voice. "The design is not the problem." Dante chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated through her. "Then they will find a better material." It was that simple. In their world, problems did not dictate the outcome, will did. Her will, backed by his absolute power. This was the foundation of their partnership, a perfect fusion of her creative genius and his relentless capacity to manifest reality. He turned her in his arms, his hands sliding up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. He searched her eyes, a daily ritual, as if to reassure himself that the light he had fought so hard to protect still burned brightly. "Everything is quiet," he said, and she knew he was not talking about the acoustics of her office. He was telling her that their world was secure, that the peace he had promised her held firm. "No new whispers from the Vescovi cousins? No ambitious upstarts trying to test the borders?" she asked, her tone calm and knowing. She was no longer shielded from the darker aspects of his business. She was his confidant, his counsel, the one person he trusted with the whole truth of his life. His expression tightened for a fraction of a second. "There was a minor issue at the port. An attempt to disrupt our shipping logistics. It has been resolved." He did not need to elaborate. Resolved in Dante's world was a final, unambiguous state. As if on cue, the elevator chimed again. It was Luca, his face as impassive and grim as ever, a silent shadow of loyalty. He gave Alara a respectful nod before turning his attention to Dante. He spoke in low, clipped Italian, his words a quiet report on the resolution at the port. Alara did not flinch or turn away. She understood most of the language now, another tool she had acquired for navigating their life. She caught phrases about impounded cargo and revoked business licenses, the clean, legitimate weapons Dante now preferred to wield. But she also heard a name, a low-level enforcer for a rival faction, followed by the phrase, "Ha preso una vacanza." He has taken a vacation. The same euphemism that had been used for Julian. It was a swift, surgical removal of a problem before it could fester, a demonstration that the Morty Empire, while striving for legitimacy, had not forgotten how to bleed its enemies. It was a necessary violence, the dark soil from which the beautiful garden of their life was able to grow. When Luca finished, Dante gave a curt nod. "Benny, assicurati chi la sua famiglia già curata." Good. Make sure his family is taken care of. It was a small detail, but it was everything. The old bosses would have simply erased the man. Dante, guided by a new code shaped by his love for Alara, removed the threat but provided for the innocent, a quiet act of mercy amidst the ruthlessness. Luca nodded once and was gone as silently as he had appeared. Dante turned his full attention back to Alara, his eyes searching hers for any sign of fear or revulsion. He found none. He found only understanding and a shared strength that was, to him, more precious than any part of his empire. "This is what I meant," he said, his voice laced with a familiar, ancient regret. "This ugliness still touches our life." She reached up and placed her hand on his jaw, her touch firm and reassuring. "It's not ugliness, Dante. It's the wall that keeps us safe." "I am not your mother. I will not break. I chose this world when I chose you. I choose it every day." Her acceptance was his absolution. It was the final piece of the peace he had sought for his entire life. He had spent years building an empire of fear and power, but he had only found his kingdom when he laid it at her feet. He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was full of all the unspoken things between them. The violent beginning, the quiet understanding, the fierce, unyielding love that had become the center of their universe. It was a kiss of equals, of partners who had faced the reckoning and built a future from the ashes. Later that evening, they stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the distant sounds of a city that never slept, a city that was now indelibly marked by their combined ambition. A new tower was rising in the distance, one she had designed, one he had built. It was a physical symbol of their union, a monument of steel and glass born from a contract made in shattered porcelain. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as she leaned her head back against him. The velvet box with its impossibly large diamond was a distant memory, replaced by the simple, elegant platinum band she now wore, a circle of permanence and choice. "Are you happy, Alara?" he asked, his voice a soft murmur against her skin. She placed her hand over his, her fingers intertwining with his. She thought of the fear and the silence of her past, and of the vibrant, challenging, and deeply fulfilling life she lived now. She thought of the man who had shattered one world to offer her another, a man who had reshaped his very soul for her. "I am more than happy," she whispered, turning her head to kiss his cheek. "I am home." The cool night air eventually drove them inside, from the sprawling view of their domain to the quiet intimacy of the library. It had become her favorite room, a sanctuary of shared thoughts and quiet companionship. Dante poured a single glass of scotch and left it on the mahogany table, forgoing one for himself as he often did now when they were alone. He watched as she moved through the room, her fingers trailing over the spines of books on structural engineering and Renaissance art. She stopped before a framed black-and-white photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of her father, Arthur, standing proudly on the construction site of his first major project. She felt a familiar pang, a mixture of love and loss. He would have been so proud of the work she was doing, and he would have been utterly terrified of the man she had married. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that if he could see the way Dante looked at her, the absolute devotion in his eyes, he would have understood. He would have seen that she was not just protected, she was cherished. A soft, barely perceptible flutter deep within her drew her from her thoughts. Her hand moved instinctively to rest on her lower abdomen, a gentle, protective gesture that had become second nature over the last few months. Dante saw it. He saw everything when it came to her. He crossed the room in a few silent strides, his presence a solid, comforting weight behind her. His large, warm hand came to cover hers, his touch infinitely tender. For a long moment, they stood like that, two powerful, formidable people rendered still and reverent by the tiny, nascent life that bound them more completely than any vow or contract. This was the future he had been fighting for, the true reason for dismantling the old ways. It was no longer just for her. "I told you I would build a safer world for you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. Now it is for him, or her, a world they can be proud of. He bent his head, his lips brushing the sensitive skin behind her ear. "You saved me, Miyakara," he whispered, the confession a raw and beautiful truth. "You think I saved you that night in the restaurant, but I was becoming my father, a king in an empty, silent castle. You gave my kingdom a heart. You gave it a future." Alara turned in his arms, her own eyes shimmering. She looked at his hands, the ones that covered hers. They were hands that had broken a man, that had signed orders that ended lives, that had commanded an empire. And yet, they were the same hands that held her with such impossible gentleness, the hands that would one day hold their child. She lifted her own hand, looking at the simple platinum band on her finger. The desperate lie she had told had blossomed into the most profound truth of her life. Their story was not a romance in the traditional sense. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes a home is not a place you find, but one you build, even if the foundations are laid in wreckage. Their legacy would not be one of fear and blood, but one of soaring towers and unshakable love, a new dynasty, born not of succession, but of a conscious, deliberate, and fiercely protected choice.